This episode is sponsored by Koyeb.com. Koyeb is a developer-friendly serverless platform to deploy apps globally. Stick around till later to learn more. This is Cup of Go for September 29, 2023. Keep up to date with the important happenings in the Go community in 15 minutes per week. I'm Jonathan Hall.
And I'm Shai Nechmad.
Morning, Shai. How was your week?
It was bad.
Uh-oh.
I didn't, Sunday, Monday was fun. It was Yom Kippur, which is another religious holiday. It's the season of Jewish holidays. I went to the synagogue and whatever. It was nice. And then the rest of the week was quarterly roadmap planning at my new work, which was very educational. And I learned a lot about the company and all the departments and what everybody's doing and how to measure estimates and dependencies and all that. And I haven't seen a single line of code all week. Save me. Let's talk about something technical before I die.
All right, let's talk about the big thing that was just announced today or yesterday. We have a pre-release announcement coming out for next week.
Yeah, so it's a security pre-announcement for a Go 121.2 and a Go 129. It's a minor release that includes private security fixes to the tool chain.
We should just pre-record this segment because it's the same every time, isn't it?
Yeah. Next time, we might know what the CVE was about. Just put on your calendars October 5th. You have to update. Just schedule that, maintenance on your on-call ahead of time. And while you're opening October and scheduling stuff, October 19th is my birthday. You could buy yourself cups, which would be a nice gift for me.
I just had mine a couple weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations.
Thanks. I'm getting old.
What do you want to do when you grow up?
I don't want to grow up. What are you talking about?
All right, let's do conferences. So we have two conferences to mention. First one is Go West Conference in Utah, Leahy, Utah, October 27th. Oh, well, you have your calendar open. So October 27th, it's a hybrid conference for the Rocky Mountain West communities. There's no schedule yet, so I'm not sure what is going to be in the speakers. It's all coming soon. If you want to do call for papers, whatever, or get tickets, now is a pretty good time. But you can also wait until you know who's talking. And there's another meetup, the Go Performance meetup. You can submit your talks by October 7th. And the meetup is planned for early November 2023. This is the first Go Performance meetup, which is really interesting. If you're into performance, go hand in your talk. There's also a form for listeners. If you have a topic you're interested in, but you don't feel comfortable enough talking about it, there's another form for you to submit that. And finally, if you want to be a sponsor, you can talk to them as well. Link is in the show notes. All right, let's talk about stuff in Go and not stuff around Go.
Let's talk about interns. Wait, interns? Mm-hmm. No, intern. Yeah, so there's a proposal. Came out. It's been out about 3 weeks. It's quite popular. It was actually brought to our attention on the Cup of Go Slack channel. It's about adding the intern package. So we can finally have unpaid people doing our Go coding for us, I guess is the plan here.
Did you listen to Inside when it came out on Netflix by Bo Burnham?
No.
He has a song called Intern. Maybe we can put a snippet here because it's just too funny. Does anyone want a coffee? Because I'm making a round. Someone unpaid. Bam, bam.
There, the music's already in there. We don't even need to do an edit.
So what's Intern actually about? I assume it's not the Go toolchain making me coffee.
No, I don't think it is. So I had to look it up. I wasn't really familiar with the concept, but actually I was familiar with the concept, just not that name. The basic idea is don't duplicate your memory. If you have the string, I don't know, Bob in memory 50 times, maybe you could have everything point to that one location rather than duplicating that all over the place. It's a little more complicated than that, but you get the idea. And there are some third-party packages that do some of this, but the idea is to create a part of the standard library to do this for you, to reduce memory pressure and potentially, I suppose, performance as well in some cases. So that's a really high-level overview, and I probably butchered it according to anybody who actually understands what's going on. I think that's the gist of it.
I really suggest reading the proposal, not necessarily because it's super practical to your next coding task right now, but at least for me, just full disclosure, it took me like 3-4 reads to understand, but sounds like a useful addition to the standard library, and I feel like I'm a better programmer after I read it 3-4 times. Also, since this is something related to performance, one thing I found interesting was, today you really have to know a lot about interning and the third-party package and the fact that you need it. But to me, it seems like, if you, for example, run Go tests with a minus profile flag, it should tell you hey, look at this, you should intern this, right? Or maybe even from PGO, like if you see a ton of memory footprint for the same string. Might be a simplification again, but I think it can be done. So an interesting proposal. It's still open. There's not a ton of discussion, but it is interesting. And one interesting part about it that I think we can all understand is that interning is kind of a weird term, and it requires knowledge of other systems. And, in Java, it means different things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Russ suggested, Russ Cox from the Go team suggested renaming it. And that opened the whole, renaming the package. That totally opened the whole thing in my mind of what does this actually mean? Is this a handle? Is this a dedupe? Is this I immediately, regressed back to, okay, this is string manager factory handler factory implementation, back to the old C# days.
I can say I'm really glad that Russ brought up the concept of naming, because that's something I have lots of opinions about. So I'm going to go add a whole bunch of comments about what color this bike shed should be.
Yeah. But right now it's probably going to end up being called unique and not intern, which is probably worse in my opinion. But
it certainly makes for fewer interesting jokes about coffee.
Yeah. So if you have a slightly better name than unique.handle, go offer it in the issue. Link is in the show notes. Last week, we fulfilled one promise of backward compatibility. Right now, we're in the future, but we still want to continue to keep promises, whether they are about the past or about the future. And it just so happens that the promise we're fulfilling is also about fulfilling promises for the past and the future, because we're talking about forward compatibility. So if you missed last week's episode, go listen to it. It's a pretty good one. But, Go 121 has really expanded its commitment to backward compatibility, with the bottom line of that post being there's not going to be a Go 2. So we're not going to have the Python 2 to Python 3 debacle in Go, which I think is good. I don't know. Maybe, John, you think that the language does deserve a fresh new version?
There are some things I'd love to get rid of, but not at the expense of breaking everything.
So when talking about forward compatibility, it's a bit harder to imagine, at least for me, because who knows what the future will be? What does that even... But what they are specifically talking about is that, when you need a newer Go toolchain, you get it from the Go command. Same like NVM or Rust up in Rust. That's just built in to the Go command. So if you're running Go build and the Go mod file says 121.1, but you have 121.0, it's actually going to get you the correct toolchain one. And there's also a new toolchain line in Go mod. So you can define in your Go mod file what's the minimum toolchain to use when working in a particular module. And that doesn't impose a requirement on other modules. So basically, the combination of these two things is you always know what Go toolchain you need. You never have to manually download and install a Go toolchain, because the Go command's going to take care of it for you. And, I think in a year's time, people are just not going to know, even other than library maintainers who really want to stick to a specific version. People are just not going to know, because it's just going to work for them. Even once, new toolchains are being introduced, you don't want to miscompile old code or, miscompile new code with old toolchains. So this sort of forward compatibility promise will make sure that your toolchain is always fitting to what you want to do. This double promise of backwards and forward compatibility really amazed me. It seems like the language is getting more and more mature and worries about more and more stuff that people could point at and be like, oh, but what about that? There isn't a lot of stuff in Go that I can point at and be like, oh, but what if this and that will happen? Feels like they took care of everything. I think this is a really good promise for people who have, Go in enterprise or are trying to introduce it to a place where that's rather risk averse. This is not a new language anymore. In companies that are risk averse, this is not cutting edge, right? This is super stable, rock solid. You can build whole enterprises on it. At least that's my feeling. And we finally fulfilled our promises from that episode where we had a huge backlog and you're like, yeah, we promised we'll get to that, and that. We cleared our backlog. I feel really good about it.
I have to say this feature leaves me with questions.
Ooh, which ones?
I think the biggest one is what's going to happen to our build times? I mean, if you have 50 different dependencies and each one defines a different tool chain and you're running that GitHub Actions or Docker somewhere and you don't have a cache, how long is it going to take to download all these new dependencies that weren't there before? And more important, how are we going to solve that?
So that's a good question, but basically you guarantee that your program won't be compiled against older version of some version. You could do that now, but if you required a particular version of Go, there wasn't any way to express that. You had to do it in your GitHub Actions anyway. So people who already have this problem and solved it in GitHub Actions are just going to get a better experience. GitHub Actions or any other CI pipeline.
I don't think that's true, though, because now our dependencies can be defining different toolchain versions, and we don't control that anymore.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that if your dependencies are stuck on an old version and you have a new version, what actually happened is that stuff would be miscompiled and you'll have bugs, you wouldn't understand them, and you'll file bugs and you discover it in runtime instead of compile time.
I completely understand and appreciate the problem that's being solved. I just think it's adding another problem, which is that build times will take longer now because you have to download 16 different versions of the toolchain potentially.
I assume most people, because newer versions of Go are very backward compatible, most library developers won't define a strict version. They will define a minimum version. And because we have backward compatibility, that's where the, combo is working really well. If my code compiled well on Go 1.18, it's a really safe bet to say it's going to be really good on 122, right? We had, right now in the upgrade, we had the init issue where init order was sort of messed up and some people, including yourselves, had like seg faults and it's weird stuff happening and they had to fix it. And these sort of things will happen. But I think for most libraries and for most code, this is not a real issue and they can just stay on latest anyway.
And I guess my second question is, what happens if you have two modules, two dependencies that don't work well together? And I think I've answered this question in my head. But my thought was, what if module A depends on some new symbol in the standard library that module B doesn't have because it specifies an old version of the toolchain? And I suspect the answer is that the Go line defines which version of the standard library is used, but the toolchain defines how it's compiled.
I'm actually not sure. That's an interesting question. But if there is a real conflict, all this proposal does is just surface it.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
it's not like this problem didn't exist before this forward compatibility promise. It's just that now you might have a way to either surface this problem or even solve it. But that's an interesting question. Maybe we can discuss it in the Slack channel.
Perfect.
Cool. So we talked about backward compatibility last week. We talked about forward compatibility this week. Let's talk about current compatibility of our current tools to our current capabilities.
So there's two related stories here. The first is a blog post that came out just a couple days ago by Ian Lance Taylor from the Go team. It's on the official Go blog. It's called Deconstructing Type Parameters. And it's basically a gentle introduction into type parameters or generics in Go. So if you've been living under a rock, like I have been, and haven't used generics yet, really, since Go 1.18 was released, this is probably a good introduction to the concept for you if you haven't already read one by someone else. But you know who else has been living under a rock besides me?
The LLM world.
Yes. ChatGPT that lives under a rock too, and until very recently didn't even know that generics existed in Go. But as you may have read in the news, ChatGPT has updated its data set to January 2022. Do you remember, Shai, when Go 1.18 was released?
Prior to that.
No. It was right after that. It was released in February of 2022, a month later. So ChatGPT understands that generics exist and has a limited understanding of them based on the pre-release version of Go 1.18. So you can
and we played around with it. We did some investigative journalism for y'all. And the bottom line is that ChatGPT is similar to Jonathan in the fact that it has knowledge about generics, but it doesn't really understand Go generics because it hasn't played around with it enough yet.
Exactly.
We tried feeding it some prompts that will yield Go generic code or maybe yield some educational explanations. When I tried to tell it, please write a generic Go code, it was like, in Go, you can't really do that. And here's a super ugly function with that accepts interface and returns interface and does reflect and switch on the, kind and So for me, it didn't work at all. And you also tried to ask it some questions and it was like very limited knowledge.
Yeah, it basically said, as of January 2022, I don't know about this. However, Go 1.18 should have this, and here's what I think it might have included.
So I guess our normal caveat of for Go, LLMs are really good because the Go code looks really well and has limited tokens because it has tabs and everything is formatted the same way. Doesn't mean that it yields best practices. It's the average of what you find in GitHub. Since the knowledge cutoff, it's not the best programmer. It's not really intelligent. So important to review that and make sure that if you take a solution directly from ChatGPT, you make sure that it's actually up to date. If it suggests a library, see if there are newer releases of their library or maybe competing libraries. If it suggests a specific solution, make sure that the recent versions don't have something better or maybe even something in the standard library to resolve that. And it doesn't really understand Go generics, but so do we. So I feel good about it. We have a few extra things we want to mention. So we're going to go a bit over time. If you already reached, you already parked your bike or parked your car or you're done with your run, go for another lap. John, do you know about the race detector?
I love the race detector.
What does it do?
It tells me when NASCAR's on TV.
The thing is, you took that joke and you took the tamest version of it. As two white-ish guys, we couldn't really go a lot further, but I'm not even going to say it because Philippe was going to have to bleep it, and I don't want to get canceled. But there were other spicier options there, let's just say. Okay, so what does the race detector do?
It tells you if you have data that is potentially unprotected by multiple Go routines accessing it simultaneously.
Yeah, so this is a class A nasty bug, right? Super hard from reading the code, it's really hard to understand it because you read the code like you read anything, left to right, top to bottom. But in reality, code doesn't run like that, especially when you have multiple threads. So for humans, it's really hard to catch. And, the Go race detector saved my ass a bunch of times. The interesting part about this proposal, remembering that the race detector exists and you should use it in the same way that last week we mentioned, test minus shuffle. This specific issue, this is not actually a proposal, it's a bug report, was just running a Go test with the race on different versions and seeing the time that it takes for 120 and 121 to do the race detection. In 121, minus race hangs for 1 second, which sounds like a bug. But in reality, what happened was that the sleep time was 1,000. But it was in milliseconds, and they actually forgot to do times 1,000. And basically what happened is from 113 to 120, the add exit sleep flag did nothing, and then 121 fixed it. And the Go race detector has its own finalization routine, and it has to sleep when it does that. And the fact that it does that, is it a bug fix? Is it not a bug fix? It's unclear, but at least now it respects it the way it should have been. I don't think this is a good default. I think it should be a bug, but it's up to the project. It's not this specific issue was closed. So, and there is a super interesting discussion if you really want to go deep about it, why does the race detector sleep at the end? Because why would it? The thing is that if you have background threads, destructors, globals, defers that sleep, some static objects, memory arenas, which was recently introduced, right? All these sort of, I can say leftovers in the memory. If you don't do that, just sleep for 1 second, you don't give these other threads a chance to expose their data races. This is really bad because every time you run the race detector, you wait for 1 second. It's super frustrating. But if it detects more data races, it's a hard trade-off to give up. And since it's a flag, you can configure it if you want. So a super interesting issue, mostly a reason to remember that the race detector exists. And if you don't run it on your test, you should. And I think that wraps it up for this week. We have a whole other bunch of stuff we want to discuss, but we're just not going to get to it. Wait for next week. Sorry, same post. We've been moving 7 times from the backlog to the news items this week.
We do have a good interview coming up with, introduce our guest, Shai.
It's Ian Smith. He's the developer behind Perigo, which is a framework for writing microservices, but deploying them like a monolith. If you're into microservices, WebAssembly, or someone who's just really passionate about their project, you should stick around and listen.
I think the only buzzword we don't have in the interview is blockchain. So
a blockchain AI,
we covered AI already in this episode, though, so we at least got that one covered.
Look for your bingo cards. There's only one thing. There's the middle section where it says, another Go release, minor release, and you're good.
All right, see you next week, Shai.
Bye. This episode is sponsored by Koyab.com. Koyab is a developer-friendly serverless platform to deploy apps globally. No ops, no servers, no infrastructure management. If you have web applications, APIs, event-driven serverless functions, background workers, and even cron jobs. Well, if you have all that, your software architecture with too much work on their hands, because you can probably solve your problem with less stuff. But if you need some place to put all these things, Koyab is a place to go. Super crisp UI, super fun experience, and they are cranking out features like crazy. They just announced a public preview of 4 new locations and multi-region deployment, which is huge if you need, a bit more reliability, a bit more resiliency. What happens if Atlantis takes over Europe and puts it underwater? Well, with Koyab, you have multi-region, so you don't have to worry about it. You can put your stuff in US, Germany, France, Japan, like just globally, right? Which is great. Also, not just for reliability, also if you want people to answer, your servers to answer faster to people in those geographical locations. Thanks, Koyab, for your partnership. If people want to talk to us, where should they do that, John?
The best place to talk to me is at the pub around the corner here in Amsterdam. If that's too far away, though, then Slack is a great place to go. A Cup of Go channel on the Go for Slack. Email works. news@cupago.dev.
My email has been kind of off recently, actually. I have to check that. I have my business email, and the delays have gotten from 1 minute to 15 minutes. I don't know why. Yeah, maybe I should get Michael to set up his email server for me. That could be fun. But you don't have to have your own email server written in Go to talk to us. You can just use your own client and server, even though it's preferable. That's news@cupago.dev, news@cupago.dev. That's also our site, cupago.dev. You can find everything there, including our merch store, which has cups, stickers, and it does have a wireless charger.
But nobody bought yet.
Dust. Nobody bought it yet,
you could
including
be the first.
Jonathan and myself, because we don't have anything that can be wirelessly charged. If you want to be the first brave soul to try it out, it's super expensive, and I can't recommend or not recommend it. It's completely experimental. So good luck with that. If you do like the show, we would appreciate, sharing it with your coworkers, co-students, just people, your next Go meetup. You can leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You cannot or should not leave a review on Google Podcasts, because unsurprisingly, Google are killing another product. It's funny. I sent you that thing about Google killing Google Podcasts. And since they also announced their killing their whiteboard thing, Google Jamboard.
I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah, they are also killing that. If you were in the educational space, you would know about it. It's a super good whiteboard thing. And obviously, they're killing that as well. So don't leave reviews on Google Podcasts, because I assume the migration to YouTube Music is not going to include the ratings. But try YouTube Music for that. I don't know. I'm not really a fan of YouTube Music, but if you want to listen to your podcasts there, just make sure to leave a review. Wherever you listen to your podcast, let's just put it like that. Thanks a lot for listening. And coming up, we have a super interesting interview with Ian Smith. Stick around.
See ya.
So, John, we've been recording this show, for a while now.
Yeah.
It's been, almost a year?
Not quite. I think we started in January, was it? So
yeah, so
3/4 of a year.
Point. And we're doing it, I'm here in Israel. You're doing it there in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
But we have, similar call and response at this point, right?
Yeah.
I tell a joke, it's hilarious, you laugh.
Big fat air quotes. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's harder to do it, it's good that the show is distributed, but it's harder to ship it like that. If we were in the same room, it was a lot easier.
Yeah?
Yeah, if only someone here could talk with us about the benefits of distributed versus doing it all in the same package. Oh, hey, Ian.
Howdy.
Hi, Ian.
All right. Well, we have Ian Smith on the call today, the brains and bronze behind Perigo. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But first of all, Ian, how about you introduce yourself?
My name's Ian Smith. I'm the founder of a company. I quit my day job about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, to work on Perigo. For what it's worth, I got a PhD in computer science back in the 20th century, for those of you that remember the 20th century. And I'm recovering pretty nicely from that. I feel like, I'm a lot more healthy now. than I was before.
So do you still have bell bottoms from the 20th century?
I don't have any bell bottoms. I was not cool enough to have those kind of things. Yeah, so I was actually a goth kid in the 20th
Whoa,
century.
that might be
believe it or
cooler.
not. Yeah, well, I have pictures to prove it. I had a lot of hair back then.
I'm envious.
It's funny you say, the people, if you remember the 20th century, and then you might be shocked to realize that a big portion of our audience was not born in the 20th century even.
Yeah.
Like, someone born in the 21st century is 23 now. So
Yeah, yeah. But it just, not that makes me feel old and bitter or anything, but yeah, I understand that.
So before we dive into Perigo, which we're definitely going to do, we owe a shout out to Josh, who gave us an idea to run a thread asking who wants to interview and who wants to talk. And Ian, you've been super proactive and just reached out to us, which we really appreciate. That's really, really cool. There are a ton of good things that came from this impromptu people talking with other people on Slack. The first one being, by the way, this show. Like a super random message from me to Jonathan doing exactly the same. Jonathan was like, hey, anyone want to do a podcast? And I was like, yeah. And here we are. So we really, really appreciate you reaching out and taking the time to come talk with us.
Like I said, I can talk about any topic for any length of time from 5 minutes to a semester.
So for those of us who don't know at all, like going in completely blind, what is Perigo?
Perigo is an open source tool to try to help people deal with the practical problems of building distributed systems as microservices, because building microservices is just a lot harder. It has all of the usual problems of distributed systems, and the dirty little secret is nobody talks about that. They talk about the benefits, of which there are some, but it's just a lot harder if you're an actual developer actually building things. My personal favorite is a distributed system can get 68% up, right? That is a completely valid thing for a distributed system to do. And what does that mean? What should the world be doing when it's 68% booted? So it's really a tool for developers, but, it has all of the usual software sort of tooling benefits. Yeah, it's taken a long time to get the API into the state that it's in now. Reid Hoffman, I don't know how familiar people are with Reid Hoffman, but one of the guys that founded LinkedIn, he said, if you aren't embarrassed by the first version of your product, you waited too long. And I'm pretty embarrassed. So I feel good about talking about it now.
Well, to be fair, Perigo is on 0.4 right now, right?
0.3, yeah, but it's the API that took the longest time. The programming model took a long time too. So this is actually really the fourth rewrite of the thing, because I kept building versions, and eventually, I got something I was happy with, but it took a while, a year, basically.
So before we go too far, how do you spell it? Because I've already thought of 4 different spellings and none of them are working on Google. So I'm sure our listeners are having the same problem.
Parigot. It is a French word that means of Paris. Like we would say, his driving is very New Yorkish. Well, that's what that adjective means in French.
I found it. So github.com/IanSmith/Perigo.
Yep.
Awesome.
Or perigo.info, and obviously both links are in the show notes for you all.
Or Parigot if you're not good with French, right?
Yeah.
I have to say, on my slides when I've given a couple presentations about it, I have to put the phonetic, how to say it underneath for the benefit of the Americans.
Nice.
Yeah, I do it in Slack. I just recently joined a pretty big company that has a lot of our go-to-market team are in America, and every Zoom call is like, "Oh, Shay, nice to meet you." I'm like, no, it's Shay. It's stupid spelling. It's not your fault.
So you said this is for the Americans. And before we were recording, we were talking about where we lived before. Are you American? Or I know you lived in Paris for a while, but I don't know where you're natively from.
Yes, I'm American. I'm a proud son of 1776 or whatever that's. I can't remember what that phrase is. Yeah. But yeah, I lived in Paris. They almost took away my passport because, you go to France, you come back to America. They're not happy about that kind of stuff. Freedom fries and all. But so I lived in Paris for 4 years. I also spent some time I lived in Bulgaria for about a year. So yeah, I'm pretty familiar with the other side of the water.
Awesome.
I live in Atlanta now.
Now you're in Atlanta. And as I was saying before recording, I worked for a company in Atlanta. I had the pleasure of was at the time the longest flight in the world from Johannesburg to Atlanta, 16 and a half hours.
How much code did you write? Or was that before laptops?
That was the 20th century. I was still using an abacus.
All right. So getting us somewhat back on track. It's not fully back on track. Don't worry. If you're actually going to want us to talk about like microservices, you probably need to skip 30 seconds ahead because I just want to
We'll put a timestamp in the description if you want to jump.
because you said that Perigo is of Paris in the same way that people say, this person's driving is New Yorkish. In the same way that in many of the code teams that I've worked in, the people could say, oh, this is a really Jerusalem PR. This is not, it can go through. You need to fix this and that design. So let me get back. I'm sorry. High level, the way I understand it is that building microservices is harder because you separate different containers and then you have to deal with how do you deploy it. And then someone says Kubernetes and then you curse yourself for the next 2 years. But there is the benefit, which is mostly, decoupling your software. And then it's like technical problems, but the organizational benefit. Because different teams can release different parts, different components of the software theoretically independently. It does require still a little bit of finesse, like don't do the same DB and make sure you don't expose state in the API and stuff like that to actually make it decoupled. Let's say I have a somewhat well-architected microservice architecture right now. Would using Perigo make it easier from like a DevOps and, operational standpoint without harming the benefits? Like the teams can still work independently?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a key effort. I personally have a joke about Kubernetes. I know you just made one too, although you may not have admitted it. It takes 2 years to implement Kubernetes. But I have a joke, which is half a joke, which is if I don't know the name of the firm you work for, you don't have a problem big enough to justify Kubernetes. And that's a little bit of an overstatement, but it's not a tremendous overstatement. So part of this is to give people a simpler, what I call middle ground between kind of running a bunch of things from the command line yourself and Kubernetes on the other end, which people are jumping to with both feet. So yeah, it will help you. The big thing that it'll help you with is things that you want in dev that you may or may not want in prod. So a simple example of that is testing. If you've ever worked on a microservices project, testing is an absolute nightmare because the state of the system can get, really, really off, in terms of what you're trying to test. I'll just give you another example is from the real world. There's a big Stripe office here in Atlanta. I met somebody from there. They have about 300 microservices in production. So how do you test your code? Like you want to test your code, but it exists in this world. What would that look like, right? How should you do that? And it's hard to do. That was one of the sort of inspirations for Perigo. I had the problems myself as a developer, but repeatability or anything that needs to be in a very well-defined state is going to be a lot easier using Perigo.
I wish you mentioned Stripe as an example, but I wish Square, which also has microservice architecture, would have listened, because I know they use Go internally, but unfortunately, I also know they had a day-long outage. So people who've been using Square for payment processing, they got their tests in prod, and man, it was a long 24 hours for them. I'm not jealous of anyone who has to use Square alone.
They test in prod at Stripe.
Yeah. High level, how does Perigo work?
This is great to be on the Go podcast, a Go-based podcast, because it's actually an easy question to answer for Go people, which is move everything behind channels, right? Mm-hmm. Because you can block on them and do timeouts and all of the usual things that you kind of would expect from a network. But by hiding everything behind channels, microservices can talk to each other without knowing what the network or lack of it is. So if you run in one process, the channels are kind of more or less directly connected, one process to another. I say process, WASM program. And we should talk about WASM at some point. But the upshot of it is that if you hide everything behind channels, you can do select and you're good to go because you get a concurrent system, but it is singly threaded for any individual program. So if you have 5 services, they can run concurrently, but each individual only gets a single thread, which is much easier also for debugging because, let's also face it, multi-threading with shared memory is really hard. And that's why channels exist, right?
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like Perigo is kind of a different way to build your microservices architecture. In other words, I'm not going to just say, I have this microservices architecture. It's a little bit clunky. I want to improve it. Let's just go add Perigo. That doesn't sound like that's the way to go, right?
At the moment, that's certainly true. There are are some things I have planned on the roadmap kind of things that would, for example, let you partially try Perigo. So you could have some of your services written using Perigo and some of them written, if you will, the old way. And that's basically by using gRPC to talk to each other, because that's what most people use for their microservices. So that's the first step. The second step is supporting more and more of the sort of APIs that people expect. gRPC is one, but I actually already support protobufs. So all of the microservices and Perigo itself are defined in protofile. And so you just generate a bunch of code from those to handle all of the communication and so forth. In fact, we not only generate data structures, we generate all the communication, initialization. There's a lot of stuff that is machine generated in Perigo. It's about almost as much machine generated code itself as handwritten code, if you will, about 20,000 lines each.
So a lot of the boilerplate of writing microservices would be taken care of by the framework, but I have to define a well-defined spec in gRPC.
Well, yeah, don't say gRPC. This is really protobufs.
Oh yeah, so
gRPC also implies protobufs, but they're kind of a network protocol as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, and obviously I can't like just out of the box sort of say, oh yeah, gRPC, no problem, because what does that even mean if you've got 10 services running in the same program?
Yeah.
Should I use gRPC between the channels? I mean, that seems kind of silly.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't specifically say gRPC, but we're certainly working on trying to get that as when you deploy as microservices, we'll want you to be able to work with existing code in a nice way. There are a bunch of other people, which I'm happy to discuss with folks who are interested. Send me an email, shoot me an email or something. There are other people trying to do WASM-based microservices in the shortest path from existing code. We could talk about it, but philosophy standpoint, I was like, I'm not going to build Linux again, and I'm not going to build Unix again. How does it go? Unix is not only dead, but it's starting to smell bad. So, I'm an old school Unix guy, but I kind of felt like it was time to think about other ways of defining things other than file descriptors, which is fundamentally what Unix is.
Yeah.
I guess this is a good chance to pause and ask, if people want to reach you, just because you mentioned, come talk to me. Where can people find you other than the Go for Slack?
All right. I'm in the Cup of Go channel. Definitely, you can reach me there. I'm Ian Smith, no surprise. I'm Ian Smith on Twitter. I'm Ian Smith on GitHub. See, that's how old I am. You can tell I'm old because I have my name actually.
OG usernames on all the...
OG usernames, yeah. But the main way is Ian Smith, which is IANSMITH, at perigo.info, which is also the documentation website for Perigo, and that's PARIGOT.info. And yeah, there's domain squatters even in other languages. So guy tried to sell me Perigo.com for like $2,000, and I was like, nah, I'm not ready to do that.
Well, maybe not yet. If you're a domain squatter and you're listening, go pick on another domain. Go find squat on some Rust and the Scala domains. Leave the Go domains alone.
So I'm curious to talk about this WebAssembly angle. First question, why WebAssembly? Why not just Go binaries?
Well, that is an excellent question. And let me tell you that I have days when I wish I had made a different decision, as you were suggesting. WebAssembly, though, offers a big benefit. You were making a point a minute ago about just how can I just easily move my stuff onto Perigo. Well, Perigo is actually language neutral. I implement my stuff in Go, and the client programs that I write are Go because that's the language I like. But WASM, you could compile that from just about anything these days. And also, definition of the Perigo infrastructure is done at the WASM level so that you could write Python that talks to it just as well as you can write Go. Now, to make it Pythonic, which I've recently learned is the correct adjective, you may need a client-side library to make it more feel like Python, but there's no reason you can't just call the functions the same way that the Go code does, and it'll work just fine. So this protobufs.protofiles and WASM means that you can also have multiple languages in your same project, which is actually something that people like about microservices, that I can write my AI code or whatever in Python, and it's just behind a service that nobody needs to know it's written in Python.
Yeah, and the alternative, let's say if you're listening to this show, probably most of your backend is Go, and it's microservices, and it's separated by various RPC, whether it's OpenAPI, or gRPC, yay, right? But there does come a time where you want a specific thing. You mentioned AI, referring to like, let's do machine learning, and that can be done with Python. And my previous company, we had a really specific part of the tech stack where we wanted to use some data processing language called JSONata, which is a really, really strong engine to working with JSON data. And, I already started, we really had to choose between two evils, either setting up a different language microservice, and then starting to work with Node in the back end, which we didn't have up until then. We had Python, Scala, and Go, and it was like, okay, another one, seriously? Then you have to pick, it's Node, is it Dino, is it whatever? It's not a language any of us know, like the ins and outs of. But we, setting up a different language was so rough. Either you do a whole different microservices, or you go down the madness route of bindings, which is what we ended up doing. We ended up doing V8 inside. Jonathan, if you remember the talk we had with Tamir, he interviewed here on the show. He was the one who did that. So it seems so like, obviously Wasm, that's a promise, but it just seems so strong to do that promise of let's do two different languages on the same binary, on the same like iron. It's going to run on the same CPU without any headaches and pain, just because the spec is so good. Is it really there yet?
Wasm? The spec for Wasm, at least the current version, is very, very good. And if you don't know this, just for the benefit of folks that haven't studied it, it's actually got what I call second mover advantage in the marketplace, which is they learned all the things that made JIT compilers have trouble in the past, and that people had to do a lot of engineering to work around. And so they actually designed the spec so that the JIT compilers can have an easier job and do a better optimization. So people are already getting like 75% native speed, on reasonable sized programs, and it's only going to get better. The difference between WASM and native code is going to be an asymptotically decreasing, function. So it's going to be around for a while. The real question is, what about the other parts of it? Like, do you want WASI? WASI is their basically Unix emulation layer with file descriptors and all the usual stuff. They're doing sockets and all of that machinery, and they're trying to make that part of a spec that you can add on to WASM. I personally just said, nah, I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to take a different route and make the programming model much more straightforward, because we only have one mechanism, which is RPC calls. That's it. There is nothing else. If you want to open a file, you call the file service, and the file service opens the file and hands you back a token, right? So I just didn't want to invent Unix again at this point.
Yeah, it's, going deeper and deeper. At some point, you have to grab the brakes.
Yeah, and Unix has been around for a long time, and so a lot of people want to build it again because they like it.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on a topic that I wanted to ask about, and that is performance. Because I can imagine a lot of listeners are probably thinking, this sounds really cool, but I want the performance of native code. And I say this, we interviewed the maintainer of Fast HTTP, which is known for being fast, but you should never use it because nobody needs that performance. I wonder if you might have the same sort of angle here. Like, yeah, it might be nice to have that extra 25% performance, but nobody really needs it. I don't know. What do you think? What do you say to these people?
I would say that human beings are the most expensive part of any project by at least 2 orders of magnitude. And if you have to throw another server in a rack, of course, nobody has racks anymore, but if you know what I mean.
If you remember the 20th century when we had racks.
We had racks in our offices. Anyway, the upshot of all that is, I think the programming efficiency is actually the thing to try to work on, not like absolute machine efficiency. I think you will get near native performance soonish out of WASM anyway, but even if it were half the speed, it's not the expensive part that you need to be optimizing, right? I mean, it's a simple example for you guys, and you'll love this or hate it, is Perigo is singly threaded from the standpoint of any single service. It's a bit like JavaScript in that it has a continuations model, or futures, they're called promises in JavaScript. But you have that main loop that has to run. Well, this is the same way, and I made that choice so that lots of different programming languages could work with the system because it didn't require multi-threading, and it made the programming model have a, I hate to say it, but a strict ordering, right?
Mm-hmm.
You do A, you do B, you do C. You don't need to worry about what you need to lock to get access to C. I felt that was, hugely beneficial for the people that implement services.
Mm-hmm.
It also means that I can clone your service to give you more copies of your service by just launching a new Go routine onto the same code path. Because under the covers, each single thread of a client program is actually a Go routine because the infrastructure uses Go routines.
So on the same machine, it's very easy to horizontally scale every instance of every service.
And for some other reasons, it's actually pretty easy to do it across multiple machines too. And the reason, if you're curious, is because you can't actually see the network. You can talk to the guy who implements the HTTP service if you want to have input or output from HTTP, but you can't see a socket. You can't see a file descriptor. You go along, and then moving your process between machines is actually not too hard because we know you don't have open sockets. You don't have open file descriptors. So that means that we can just pick up and move your process more or less at will.
Cool. You mentioned, that the expensive part is the development. And touching on, developer experience, there's one thing you mentioned, which is cognitive load, which is lowered by using Pergo. When I develop microservices and I have to worry about the network and multi-threading and then touching files and state and locks, I have a lot of cognitive load. And, your claim here is that Pergo will lower it. Also, you briefly mentioned at the beginning it's a lot easier to test. So I assume that, what you're aiming at is feedback loops, which is another core dimension of developer experience. The feedback loop is a lot faster than having to deploy it to a cluster and then wait for the pod to die and go back up and whatever. One thing I am worried about is flow state. With all this, this sort of layer between me and my machine and my code and the usual stuff I deal with, I do have to keep in mind Pergo itself, right? The paradigms and how it works and how my API is designed. Since you've mentioned you've worked on this project for a while, do you think that programming using Pergo, it has the benefits of keeping a program simple, so the cognitive load is lower. It's a single binary that you can run on your machine, so the feedback loop is pretty short, especially for testing. But how does it feel, programming it? Is it easy to get into the zone, into a flow state?
It's very good that you asked that question. I really appreciate it. A couple of episodes ago, you had someone talking about developer experience, right? And there was some great points made. I'm not saying that the person, or maybe it was you two. I don't. If you two said it, maybe it was wrong, but not your guest.
Probably was.
If it was a guest, it was right.
I guess exactly. But what I will tell you is that thing you just mentioned, getting to flow, having something that is easy to understand, I can get my feedback really quickly, is the kind of developer experience, in quotes, that I care about. That's the thing that I care about. Now, the nice thing is, since we only have one mechanism, if you need a file, you call the file service, it hands you back a token, and then you can do read on the token or something along that line, right? So it is symmetric in the sense that all of the things work the same way. The testing, there's a bunch of machinery involving testing. If you're not familiar with testing microservices, is it fair to say it's a fate worse than death? I mean, having to try
It's kind of rough.
Yeah. And so one of the things you can do is real unit tests. You can actually run your services quite easily in isolation because we know the boundaries and we can fire up just the parts that are needed. But the other thing is reliable ordering, which is pretty hard to get with most microservice infrastructures. In fact, many people don't even try. But have you ever had the problem that your tests flake occasionally because things come up in an order you weren't expecting or you didn't test for? That problem goes away. We guarantee the topological sort so that all of your dependencies are up and running before you are. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we'll complain if you build
it happens to other people's code, not mine. Mine is perfect. I'm sure many of our listeners can relate. Personally, I can't, but many of our listeners can.
Well, I never wrote any code like that, of course, in the past, but...
Yeah, I use bugless-oriented programming. I don't know if you...
The test-driven development is a really important thing for me. I'm actually a huge TDE user myself,
Mhm.
and I have not been able to get into that kind of flow with Perigo yet. And I'm not sure what needs to change, but something, and I'm not quite sure what it is yet. Because the loop of writing proto files, generating code, and then trying to design the test, I feel like the code generator should actually generate some test scaffolding as well
Mhm.
to try to make it easy to test.
So I actually, we had two things at a previous place when we used Proto extensively. So the first one was a validator. There's I don't remember the project name exactly, but it's like Proto C Gen Validate, where you can add a bunch of validation rules on top of your Proto, and then all that stuff gets auto-generated as well. And it's very easy to define high level, like this should be an email instead of just a string type, which is nice. And the second thing, it's an angle. I don't think it's popular yet, but for me, it's been working really well, is dumping the API spec into like I have a pre-trained LLM on my machine just for that, to take API and generate API tests out of some checklist. Like I opened the checklist, what API test should you run on API, REST API, blah, 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 put it in the LLM, told it now translate it to gRPC. Again, these are just like titles. It's not tied to any specific API. And then you can dump in, the gRPC, the actual proto/gRPC API. It will spit out, I don't know, something that's 60% good enough to get started working with. It compiles, and from there you can tweak it yourself. Some people feel really uncomfortable with that, and for me, for sure, the first two times it was like even the thinking part I'm gonna give to the LLM, but it worked. If talking about flow state, it really kept me in a flow state because the annoying part of getting the obvious cases out of the way and going to a checklist online trying to find what happens if this is 0, this is nil, blah blah blah. That all gets like generated, and then if you're comfortable enough thinking about the actually interesting cases, actual interesting inputs within. And if you raise the temperature of that LLM, sometimes you get really, really interesting tests. You get a lot of garbage, but you also get really interesting cases.
Yeah, I can just tell you that that's one of my standard replies to people who ask if, AI is going to replace all of us. And I say no. And one of the reasons is the perverse incentives that it creates. So I'll just give you an example with the thing you mentioned. Once you get it good enough that you stop looking at it, it becomes dangerous. So the better the AI gets, the more likely it's going to introduce a bug, security risk, what have you, that you will miss precisely because it's better. If you see where I'm going with that. And that perverse incentive is not going anywhere. And there are also studies that show that people who use AI to generate code actually put more security bugs in their code than people who don't.
That might be because they just ship more, but this is a whole different. If we're talking about stuff we can talk about for a semester, this is a whole can of auto-generated worms. And as an AI model, I cannot talk about that anymore.
I'm an old-fashioned compiler guy, right? So I use compiler tech whenever I have a problem to solve.
So early in the show, you mentioned that for the last year you've been running your own business.
Yep.
Is that business related to Perigo?
Yes.
Are you selling Perigo? Tell us how that works.
That's an excellent question. I appreciate it. So full disclosure, there is a service that is coming online that I have turning over that is based on Perigo, but Perigo is going to remain open source, free to use. BSD 3-clause license. So that is a gift to the world. You can do whatever you want with it. What I'm going to try to do is sell add-ons, particularly that are interesting to your corporate customers. For example, there'll be a service that you pay for that's like, I don't know, single sign-on, right? And using SAML to something like that. And you're free to write that service yourself, and I'll even take a pull request if you want. But that kind of thing where there's add-on services that solve some specific set of problems that a bigger organization, for example, might have, those are the kinds of things that the company is going to sell, as well as dirt cheap hosting. Because for the reasons I mentioned before, we can run on cloud hardware that's like between 50 and 90% discounted from typical. So because, as I said, we can move your program around. We can actually suspend it, move it somewhere else, and then continue running. And there's no harm to the program, which means we can use cheaper hardware.
Yeah.
So cheaper hardware, and in my mind, this could be really useful also for like scaling up and down without worrying on scaling a single interface. So if I had a thing that was I wanted to build big, but right now it's small, maybe I would think about doing serverless, but serverless has its own like whole host of problems and issues and whatever. Also a really, really good, compromise for that. That makes sense.
It is a good compromise for people who, if you don't know the old joke, it's, never underestimate the bandwidth of a large car full of mag tape, right? I mean, that's got a lot of bandwidth, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the thing that we can do fairly transparently is we can scale up your program within the constraints of a single machine, single process type, not single process, single service. That's easy for us to do. As I said, you just spawn another Go routine and spawn it onto their code and you're done, right? So now you have two things that can get requests and two copies. There's some other trickery that we're doing behind the scenes, but that's the basic gist of it. Now, that doesn't solve the problem. If you need two gigantic machines and you only want to use them when you need them, that's back to the usual set of microservice problems. Although most people don't. You can go a long way with one server in this day and age. People just get excited about Kubernetes, and I don't know, it's a thing.
Well, I think that's a good place to move on to our regular questions. You're a listener, so you know what they are, and I'm sure you're prepared.
I am.
Gun to your head, you have to take something out of Go. What's it going to be?
For me, it would be named return values. I know that somebody said that a couple weeks back, and everybody was agreeing with it. I don't like named return values. I deeply dislike this just does return? Where's the what? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. It has the defer thing that you kind of need that for. But if I was going to pick something a little more interesting than that, is that embedding struct, not embedding interfaces, embedding structs causes many people to become confused and think that Go is object-oriented, which it is not. Yeah. So that is such a gotcha that, maybe you could solve it with documentation. I don't know, but I'd probably take embedding structs out. Actually, and I don't use that feature because I find it actually leads me to making mistakes as well.
Interesting. That is a feature I use, although I'm trying to think how would I do it otherwise. I'll have to think about that. That's a good one. I like that one.
The only thing I'd say is even if you understand embedding structs, most people don't know about the performance costs of embedding structs. If you don't do it in the right order or whatever, Go is not great at, padding your struct squarely. You can end up with huge objects, even though they only hold build-ins. Really weird. I guess it's really weird for the people who wrote the compile. It's all like, it's awkward for all of us, not just the users. And the flip side of that question, which we usually ask is, you've mentioned a few different languages, a few different frameworks. What would you add to Go if you could pick, one thing to yank?
Wait, you want me to yank something or add something?
Yank from a different place. Yank is in Vim yank, like copy from one place and put it in the other.
In my language, that's called theft, which is a good thing. And I've got two that I hope will be so popular from this show that somebody will write up a proposal. And these are dash flags for the compiler. And one of them would be simple reflect only, which is a compiler choice. That means the runtime should not use the entire or should refuse access to all of the reflect library, and as a consequence, the Go compiler could do dead code elimination. Because one of the reasons it gets these huge binaries now is because it has to assume that anybody could do reflection and start calling methods on things and all that kind of stuff. So if you just said, I want to forbid the things that would cause you to not be able to do dead code elimination, then that's what I would want. I don't know if you know, but the TinyGo compiler compiles Hello World to 4 kilobytes. 4 kilobytes. Why? Because they don't implement the whole reflect library, and therefore they don't have this problem, and they do dead code elimination, and bingo. 4 kilobytes for Hello World. So that would be one. I'll throw another one at you of a very similar type. I would like to have dash near miss, which is I implement an if some struct is almost implementing an interface, I want you to give me something, either an error, a warning, I don't know what you want to call it. But the reason that we all do that trick where we say underscore equals and then we put the name of the interface and the struct in there is simply to make sure that problem is dodged, right? You want to make sure this thing implements that interface. So I'd like just to have the compiler do that for me with dash near miss, right? If I got 5 of the 6 methods from some interface, that's likely this guy thinks he implements whatever that interface is.
That sounds like a good linter.
Yeah, that would be an awesome linter, but it's rather complicated to decide when you want to, because you don't want to do a lot of false positives.
Now, you wouldn't
But,
want every
you know-
IO reader to trigger for IO read closer.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
that was just what I was about to say, because, multiple interfaces, how do you know which one to look at even? But definitely for interfaces that you wrote, like not interfaces from other packages, but interfaces that are in your project, not in one of the dependencies, I can totally get why we do that. Or maybe just same model. Well, if you're a listener and you're looking for two really good open source contributions to go, these both sound actually reasonable, which is a breath of fresh air for these responses, which are usually, I want to do, I want everything to be twice as fast.
Yeah, and I wanted to just say full credit to the Go team at Google and elsewhere, other contributors elsewhere, because the WASM support now is pretty good. It's good enough that you don't even worry, like you don't even think about generating WASM code anymore. I just ignore it and it works fine. Right? It's like there was no drop in the quality or the way the compiler's ability to produce code. It was really like smooth like butter.
Cool. Well, that's really cool, Ian. Thanks a lot for coming on and sharing about Perigo. Again, it's perigot.info. It's one time my Israeli accent comes in useful is when you have to say things how they are actually spelled. But just as a shout out for Josh, who, again, going back to how we got to this conversation, suggested we put this thread on, and then you came to us. I'll even do it in the Talon alphabet, which is that project Cursorless he's working on. So it's Pit, Air, Red, Sit, that's Perry. And then again, Gust, Odd, Trap, Got, perrygot.info. Be sure to check it out. The documentation is succinct but great. And I think if you want to set up, a small, the project in your company just to POC that it works right now, this is something that it's ready for.
Yeah, and actually, I forgot to mention this, that I'm actively looking for feedback, and I will listen to anybody, because I have literally spent a year of my life in a hole building this thing, and there is definitely things that you're going to go, oh my goodness, that's terrible. And I want to hear about that because I've been looking at it for a long time. So please, if you try it and it doesn't work or doesn't solve your problem, please tell me what's wrong with it, and I'll make a promise that I will work hard to fix all of these complaints that I get.
Yeah, now we got some more ears on it. Maybe we can get some hands and eyes on it as well. If that interests you, go check out paragon.info. Thanks a lot, Ian.
Thank you. I appreciate it.